What up guys, Joachim here, and this video is going to talk a little bit about the elements that make up language learning or that make up our expression of language. And to kind of discuss that, there is something called the CEFR, which is the Common European Framework of Reference for Language Learning. And there are categories that they make up. So if you start out, you're a beginner, eventually you work into the A1 category, which means you know very little of the language. Then there's A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And C2, I think usually would be the kind of like the highest level that you would reach in your ability to express language or understand language in a variety of ways. But there are four major areas that are part of this framework of reference that they use. And I think that as a learner of language, those tell us a lot and it can help us to be more proficient in our learning and in the way that we interact and perceive our language that we are learning, no matter what the language is. It's true for all languages. So the way that you go about learning all languages might have some unique patterns, unique needs for each language, but the categories of ways that we use it language is really going to be the same for the most part. So those areas, though, that are tested when you go for one of these tests include your listening comprehension. That would be probably the most paramount. If you can't understand the language, then you can't really speak the language. So like speaking then would be a moot point. But so comprehension is our number one category. That would be most principal among all the aspects of language learning that we can have, is just the ability to listen to the language that is spoken. Or there's we're going to focus primarily on spoken language in this case, but there are other categories and ways. But even when we talk about reading or writing, those would kind of be other categories that would kind of fall into a similar way of thinking. So I am thinking of like sign language, like that would not be a spoken language, but it is an expressive language. So just in general, we're talking about expressions of language. But so comprehension would be the number one thing that we have that we interact with languages in. So your ability to listen or watch or do something, read, in a way that expresses language. So that would be the kind of the bottom of the pyramid if we're making a pyramid of things that lead to language learning or that are involved in language learning. So listening, comprehension. So reading would go along with that though. So reading would maybe be one tier up, but it would also, because there have been cultures throughout history that did not read. They did not value written language. And the only little downside of that is that in those cultures where they don't have reading or they don't have written language to go along with their language, we don't know about their past because it wasn't passed down, or it was passed down orally, but maybe it's mixed with a lot of legends that it becomes difficult to decipher for us who are looking back at these cultures to determine what was involved, if it was where legend ended and reality began. And usually there's, you can still see a lot of things like that. I know like some Native American cultures are a lot like that. They'll have paintings or drawings that were meant to express something, but they do it in it's almost a very poetic way. But because there's not exact writing, we don't know exactly what was being communicated. And so they have their own stories. And then every continent of the world has similar cases, similar cultures that were completely oral in nature. But so at the base of our pyramid, we have comprehension, listening comprehension. Reading would be right there in the next category up, but also going along with that. So reading, for most of us, is a very important aspect of both our ability to learn language and our ability to express language, which makes writing and speaking the next categories that go up. And those would be the four major categories that we we have is listening comprehension, reading comprehension, and both of those are input. Both of those are things that are going in your ability to comprehend the language. Those are the base of our pyramid. And then the two that kind of come after that is our speaking and writing. So I think that in our learning that we should have all four of those elements eventually to be expressed. I've myself wanted to replace aspects of writing with typing because typing is a lot easier. It is very necessary, and it is very helpful in learning languages, because if you can type, you can access a lot of materials on the internet that will bring new materials and help you, but it doesn't replace writing though. So I have found that if you write something out, and writing something that you can do from the first day of language learning. The first thing I did when I was studying Greek was to actually write out the Greek alphabet with the sounds that each letter made. And, it wasn't necessarily the actual name of the letter, but it was pretty close, because, the letter C makes a C sound, and you're going to write that, if you're a native English speaker, you're going to say PSI. So just C, you're trying to make and articulate that sound, and that's typically how we would write it. There is no exact way. Usually for us, if we read the letter me, we're going to say it just like, we're going to read it, and we're going to say mu, because that's what it looks like. The ypsilon that is the letter, we're going to, as English speakers, look at that and say, oh, it's an mu. It makes a mu sound, but that's actually not the sound the letter makes. But anyways, that all aside, I started by just writing that out, and it was very effective. Within a week of writing out those letters, I had pretty much learned the entire Greek alphabet. I didn't necessarily know what all the letters were called, but I did know what sounds they made, and that's kind of what's important. When we look at a word like languages, we don't look at it and say L makes a L sound, A makes an sound, and so forth and so on throughout the word. We just see the word languages. We know the sounds of those letters. And then we've recognized the symbol altogether, unless you have dyslexia. Dyslexia would make that difficult. It's actually called word blindness. So they actually see words, and they don't necessarily see the corresponding symbol. They actually do look sometimes at words' individual letters to try to decipher and figure out what it is. But unless you're in that category, we actually learn to recognize entire words at a time, so that we don't have to kind of sound out words that way. But so if we're learning and we're putting together kind of a routine of learning that leads to that, then I think kind of those categories should be how that we go about it. So the base of our learning, the biggest part of our learning by far should be listening comprehension. And again, that goes together along with reading. So the best thing that you can have is a podcast that usually is available on the internet somewhere. I found them in nearly every language. But so the Hellenic, I don't even remember the name of it. I just go down through the categories, but I can look it up real quick. So one that I found was I'm in Latin now, shoot. So real quickly, the Hellenic American Union podcast. And so what they have is these podcasts that are available for free at their website, and you can now this is not a beginner thing, but this is an example of something. But so the beginner would have these same elements, like if you're a beginner language learner, but they're going to be much shorter, much more simplified, much easier language. And so what this does, though, this is more of an intermediate thing. So if you've been learning for a while, then you kind of come to some of these more advanced categories, and then it'll have a PDF that goes along with it and a recording. So you are both reading and listening at the same time. And then you can use a dictionary or Google Translate or something like that. Again, I've mentioned this before, you do kind of have to be careful with Google Translate, because especially for languages like Greek that are very different than English, I think it's not very different than English, but the word order can be very different. And sometimes Google Translate doesn't rightly decipher what's being communicated. Often it does, but, you know, I do come across things that I know aren't right. So I've interacted enough with the language at this point that I can figure that out. And it is helpful, but, you know, it's something to be aware of if you're using it very frequently. So I will look up those words, learn to read the transcript, and then listen to it. And then ongoing after that, I will also continue listening to it. So there's, you know, a lot of the major categories are all wrapped up in that one exercise. There is both listening, because I'm listening to the podcast, reading, because I'm reading it, and then, so writing and speaking can be integrated in this as well, because, you know, after you've done it once and you've spent a day on it, the next day, maybe you go back and write out that transcript, and then you're having like a written form of language, so you're actually communicating it back that way. Even if you're just copying, if you understand what you're copying, you know, there is an aspect, you know, maybe you'll remember this from when you were in school, or maybe you're still in school if you're watching this, but you can remember like not entirely knowing how to spell out a word, so you keep looking back at the word, and I don't know, here's a name, so if you say Yorgos, usually we'll say George for that name, but Yorgos in Greek, and maybe you don't know how to spell out that entire name, so you'll get a couple letters at a time, you'll keep looking back and forth, and then eventually through practice, you'll find that you can take the word and you know a few words at a time. And so there's improvement there that's noticeable. And in those cases, you are both looking at something and then you are generating that language on your own at that point. So maybe if you're looking at every letter, then you're not quite generating it yet, but you're learning to output the language in a written form, and that's very important. When you're listening to and reading, you're learning like the smaller sections of the podcast and looking up those words, then repeating those things out loud allows you also to have a verbal aspect of the language in that way. But so those are peripheral, they're secondary aspects of language learning where we're outputting. But the things that really lead to that are the major categories of listening and reading. And so those are the four major categories and four things that we can do when we're learning to make sure that our progress is leading to something very productive. You guys take it easy. If you have any questions, please post them in the comment section below, and I would love to hear what you think. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow for more videos. You guys take it easy, and I'll talk to you very soon.